Well, you know, if you mention the Crusades in most circles, you'll be met with instant cries of derision. There's almost nothing in history that has such universal affirmation as the fact that the Crusades were terrible, horrible, no good, rotten things. And in fact, if you're ever engaged in a conversation with someone about the history of Christianity or the fruitfulness of Christianity in building civilization and unleashing liberty and justice, of bringing to flower art, music, literature, and ideas, you're probably going to immediately be met with arguments about the Crusades. And maybe the Inquisition, if they can pronounce that big word. Now, to be sure, there are a few people who would praise the Crusades these days. They're isolated in peculiar little pockets of the world where people are still waiting for Elvis sightings and Beatles reunions and walks with little green men at midnight through Central Park. But aside from that, there really is not much in the way of positive literature or positive critiques of these great and calamitous wars that shaped the character and nature of history for nearly 500 years and still have a lingering effect on the affairs of men and nations. I want to warn you ahead of time. I'm not looking for an Elvis sighting or a Beatles reunion, and if I did see a little green man at midnight in Central Park, I don't think that I would take a walk with him. Nevertheless, I would like to present to you an alternative vision of this calamitous time in history and the conflicts that we now call the Crusades. But in order to tell the story, as is the case with any story worth telling, we probably need to back up a good bit and lay a little groundwork. Any story told entirely out of context is going to be a distorted story. And so let's back up from the time of the Crusades to the day of the prophet Muhammad. Muhammad was a remarkable visionary who devised a very simple faith of works righteousness. The great attraction of Islam, the fastest growing religion in the world, already today boasting some 1.5 billion adherents worldwide, is actually simple for us to understand because it is its simplicity. Its heresy is a heresy that we recognize only too easily because it is the heresy that we are all attracted to. It is the idea that somehow, some way, we must devise certain pious acts that will appease the wrath of God and thus will commend us to Him through our own works, through our own righteousness, through our own attempts at justifying our existence. That's the essence of Islam, boiled down to its most basic elements. Oh, to be sure, we could spend a long time, and in fact, if I had not been caught in the nether realm, otherwise known as the Charlotte airport, for several hours this morning, I would have actually had a lecture in which we could have talked a bit about the 5 pillars of Islam, the Shahada, which is the profession of faith, and the Salat, which is the regular 5 times a day rak'ateen prayer, or the Zakat, the almsgiving that every good Muslim participates in, or the Hajj, the once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage to the city of Mecca, or Saum, the fasting and the keeping of Ramadan. But of course, you're here to discover a little bit more about Richard the Lionheart and Salah ad-Din and the battles that took place for the taking of the cities of Jerusalem and Acre. So I won't divert to a discussion of these 5 pillars. They were the essence of this very simple works righteousness faith. But there was one other aspect of Islam that we do need to be a bit more familiar with. You see, in addition to the 5 pillars of Islam, the basics of personal piety for a good Muslim, there was an ideology. It's really more an ideology than it is an eschatology. In other words, it's a vision of how the world ought to work as a system. And this ideology had as its driving force something known as jihad, holy war, roughly. Now, there are all kinds of jihad mentioned in the various holy books of Islam. The Quran, which is comprised of 114 surahs, as well as various other books, the sayings of Muhammad and the sayings of the various leaders of Islam that came after, the caliphs Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali and the Umayyads. The essence, though, of this holy war or jihad can be boiled down to a handful of ideas. Now, when you hear a talking head on CNN or perhaps on the evening news with one of the network broadcasters, they will be quick to assure you that for good Muslims, jihad is really an internal struggle, a struggle for righteousness and holiness, and therefore it's one of those wonderful pious attributes like the Puritans would have had, self-examination and the wrestling with sin to the place of repentance. And indeed, there is an aspect of jihad that is an internal struggle. It's what's called the razia and the rida. They are the internal wars against apostasy. But in addition to that kind of jihad, the Quran and the other literature of Islam mentions azasin, which is the glorious cleansing of infidelity, and fida'is, which is the calling for holy martyrs for the faith, suicide assassins. And then there is dehima, the subjugation of all infidels through an oppressive subjugation tax or submission tax. There is karaj and jizira, and there is fadlak and sulta, all forms of absorption and conquest. The bottom line is that the idea of jihad is rather comprehensive. Perhaps a comparable word for us would be Weltanschauung, or worldview. See, at the heart of Islam was this notion that ultimately this very simple faith, this pathway of works righteousness, would ultimately win over the whole world one way or another. And thus, the world would begin to work aright. Now, during the formative years of his faith, Muhammad actually had very little contact with Orthodox Christianity. He may have heard the stories from a few Christian merchants and caravaneers who passed through his hometown, the great caravanning center, Mecca. But those few occasions were generally far between. Most of his understanding of the gospel was filtered through the twisted heresies of Arianism and Nestorianism, and a little later, Monophysitism. Now, for those of you who are not up on your ecumenical councils, this is not the time or the place to bring you up to speed, but you can look them up in a dictionary or an encyclopedia, and you'll quickly realize that, like Islam itself, the old heresies are still quite current. And if you followed any of the synods or general assemblies just past this summer of the Episcopalians and the Methodists and, the Presbyterians, you will know that those heresies are still quite current and with us to this day. Muhammad picked up on the stories, these various subsects of Christianity. And then they, along with the stories that he picked up from Jewish caravaneers and of the Arabian folklore that was native to his Arabian Hejaz region, he began to formulate a sort of philosophy of the world, the history of the world, to go with it. Now, as a result, Jesus to Muhammad was indeed revered as one of the prophets. But it was for him only a misunderstanding of Christ's disciples that led them to worship him as the Son of God. And they were therefore to receive special consideration from the Muslims as people of the book, but misguided nevertheless. They were infidels, according to the Quran, and had to be dealt with as such. That meant that they were unwittingly or not guilty of shameful idolatry, according to the 6th chapter of the Quran. And they were thus subject to the judgment of God, and they were subject to the wrath of the Ummah, the faithful community of Islam. In other words, Christians were a legitimate target for the jihad, all aspects of jihad, internal, external, and full-fledged warfare. No other option was tolerable to the faithful Muslim. Who will protect them, by night or by day, from the Lord of justice? Yet they are unmindful of their Lord's remembrance. Have they any other means to protect them? Their idolatry will be powerless for their salvation, nor shall they be protected from our scourge. Good things have been bestowed upon these men and upon their fathers. They have lived long and prospered, but now we shall invade their lands and curtail their borders. Can they then triumph? They have been warned by inspiration, but the deaf can hear nothing. Thus says the Quran, chapter 21. The jihad, therefore, was to be pursued at all costs. Death was not a concern to the Muslim because, according to the Quran, those who died at the hands of the infidels during jihad were actually martyrs, earning certain and immediate entrance into paradise, according to chapter 3 in the Quran. In fact, the martyrdom was considered to be the devotional pinnacle of what was called al-salam, or Islamic submission. Therefore, from the very beginning, Islam was more a political and military movement than it was any kind of religion heretofore recognized in the history of the world. Now, Muhammad never was able to realize his dreams of global subjugation. But his relatives, who assumed his mantle and thus the leadership of the Islamic peoples, the caliphs who came after him, decided to pursue that dream with an unholy vengeance. The most successful of his successors, coming just 3 years after Muhammad's death, was the rise of the Caliph Umar, who led early stinging campaigns along the southern frontier of Syria, into the fertile Mesopotamian valley of Iraq, along the Nile in Egypt, and ultimately into Palestine itself. He was a stern giant of a man, the long dark beard and a full brooding countenance. He wore a coarse, frayed garment and always carried a whip in his right fist in order to enforce a righteous humility among his men. He had very little appreciation for the accomplishments of the Christian world, which by that time had spread throughout all of the Mediterranean and was pushing upwards into the heart of Europe. As the missionary movements of men like Cyril and Methodius began to win converts from the Dnieper all the way to the Atlantic. According to Shah Nemeh, contemporary chronicle of caliphs and kings, Umar despised particularly Christian infidels for what he called their half-faith, and yearned to force their confessions, creeds, and liturgies into extinction. This is what the chronicler wrote. Umar, may he ever have peace coveted, and nothing in the flesh save the undoing of Christian arrogance. For Jews are impotent and pagans are powerless, but in Christians he saw challenge. Therefore his meat was their humiliation, his drink was their shame, his humor was their downfall, his very breathing was their destruction. To see the whole earth bow in submission to Allah was his sure desire, but to see Christendom fall was his great delight. Clearly, Umar pursued that delight with great vigor and prolificacy. By the year 64, his armies had completed their conquest of Syria. By 635, he controlled much of Egypt, and by 636, he had defeated the Byzantine army decisively in the great battle of Yarmouk, thus attaining unchallenged authority throughout the Fertile Crescent. But Umar was not content. In February 638, he entered Jerusalem riding on a white camel. Now, as always, he was dressed in his worn, filthy robes, and the army that followed him was rough and unkempt, but its discipline was comprehensive, and its victory was complete. At that point, the native Christian population of the Middle East vastly outnumbered their conquerors. But the despots imposed stern military rule upon them and began fierce persecutions of them. Before his death in 644, Umar had spread the dominion of Islam from the Euphrates across the whole North African littoral. He had conquered all of Iraq, brought the Persians to the brink of collapse. He controlled the southern Mediterranean coastline, and he had put Christendom on the defensive at every turn. In addition, he left his successors a tumultuous momentum that gave them expansive new conquests, ultimately in what today we call Spain, Sicily, Crete, and Italy. It was not until 733 when Charles Martel of the Franks stopped the Muslim advance north of the Pyrenees that the first great period of Islamic expansion came to an end. In just 100 years' time, the map of the venerable old Christian Mediterranean had been practically transformed from one vast empire of church building and mission sending into a dark Islamic Gehenna. Though the jihad had not yet conquered the whole world, it was coming tortuously, confidently close. The very existence of Byzantium seemed to hang by a mere thread. Over the course of the next 150 years or so, Islam began to chip away at the borders of Byzantium. Byzantium itself was racked with internal dissent and a host of Christian heresies which undermined its power and its military significance. Signs were written everywhere that soon perhaps all too soon, the most glorious expression of Christian civilization that the world had ever seen, Byzantium, would fall under the weight of the Islamic scimitar. Now, I've given you all of that background to enable you to understand a couple of things. Number one, all of the lands at the heart of Islam were at one time Christian lands. The Middle East was the center of Christian scholarship, Christian piety, Christian vision for the expansion of the gospel throughout the whole of the earth. It was there in the Middle East that the scriptures were carefully translated, or where the first commentaries were written, where the ecumenical councils hammered out what it meant to believe in the full sufficiency of the sacrifice of the Lord Jesus Christ. It was there in the Christian Middle East that Christianity first gave us our greatest heroes. From men like Athanasius, who stood contra mundum against heresy, to Augustine, who laid the philosophical foundations for the Western world. That was all in the Christian Middle East. And now this new insurgency, this brutal infidelity, this horrific paganism had risen up, swept out of the desert, conquered the lands, and subjugated the Christian peoples, stolen away their freedoms, plundered their wealth, desecrated their churches, stole the hearts and the minds of their children. That's the background of the Crusades. You're not likely to get that in a Ridley Scott film. You're not likely to get that from a textbook published by Houghton Mifflin. Instead, what you're likely to get is this notion of Western Europeans wishing to impose their religion on the happy peoples of the flourishing Islamic civilizations of the East. It's political incorrectness gone mad, these dead white European males imposing their wills upon the rest of the happy, peaceful world. Facts of history simply don't bear that out. The fact is that the conquest of the old centers of Christian faith in North Africa, throughout the Middle East, and then upward into the heart of Europe, deeply disturbed Christian leaders throughout the whole of Christendom. They met together often to discuss what is our responsibility to our Christian brothers and sisters now dragged off into captivity by this horrific new oppression. Do we have an obligation to go and liberate them? Should we stand with them? If we do not, are we next? And what of the desecration of the churches, the burning down of the libraries, the destruction of the fields that were once so fruitful, the deliberate deforestation of the beautiful mountains of Lebanon, the burning down of whole cities and villages? Is there no Christian obligation to stand with our brothers and sisters? Now, these questions arose in virtually every council, every synod, every major meeting of royals and ecclesiastics from the time of Umar all the way forward. The idea of some kind of holy war to avenge the subjugation of the Christian lands first came into clear focus for Pope Gregory VII, and then to his successor, Victor III. But affairs closer to home kept them both more than a little preoccupied. Soon, though, stories of gross atrocities against captive churches began to reach the West. The brutal conquest of Egypt, Syria, and Iraq has sent shudders of fear throughout kingdoms of the West. The penetration of Muslim armies into Spain, France, and Italy, and the slaughter of whole communities of believers shook their confidence even more. The Muslim horde pushed the boundaries of their imperial conquests through the Balkans and up into the heart of Europe. The vulnerability of the once seemingly invulnerable Byzantine Empire was utterly terrifying to all of the believers throughout Christendom. And horrific stories of the occupation of the Holy Land, of Jerusalem and Palestine, and the desecration of the sites that were held dear by believers everywhere distressed them no end, and soon they could no longer ignore such despotism, and they could no longer shut their ears to the cries that came from the east for help. At the Council of Clermont in 1095, Pope Urban II issued a call for a concerted and forthright action that was to be heard throughout all of Europe. He said, "From the confines of Jerusalem and from the city of Constantinople, a horrible tale has gone forth. An accursed race, a race utterly alienated from God, has invaded the lands of those Christians and depopulated them by the sword, plundering, destroying, and burning." He went on to list in detail outrages of the jihad, the plunder of churches, the rape of Christian women, the torture of priests and monks, the pilfering of villages and towns, and the occupation of the territories. He appealed to their sense of Christian mercy and their sense of European honor. "Recall the greatness of Charlemagne," he said. "O most valiant soldiers, descendants of invincible ancestors, be not degenerate. Let all hatred between you depart, all quarrels end, all wars cease. Start upon the road to the Holy Sepulchre, to tear that land from a wicked race and subject it to yourselves, thereby restoring it to Christ. I call upon you to take the cross and redeem defiled Jerusalem." Almost immediately, a vast throng assembled in a field there outside the cathedral at Clermont. The faithful cried out, chanting, "Deus vult," God wills it. The following year, the Crusades began in earnest. Now, let's pause for a little historical sidebar to remind ourselves of a few things. War is never nice. You see, the object of war generally is to kill people. It's ugly, it's messy, it's difficult, it requires great sacrifice, and to be sure, stories of valor and chivalry will always emerge from times of war, but alas, so will stories of brutality and excess. And so please understand, no one is going to try and say that the Crusades were nice. They weren't. It was war. And war is difficult, and war is complicated, and young men in war will oftentimes lose their heads and do things that they ordinarily would not do. In war, some young men may do things that they are not ordered to do. Sometimes they will be ordered to do things that are heinous and vile. So when we say that the Crusades were not intended to be an imperialistic conquest, that the rationale of the Crusades was not to plunder lands and bring home as much loot, gold, and booty as possible, Now, when I say that the Crusades actually had a Christian motivation, I don't want you to get the idea that there weren't perhaps a few Captain Jack Sparrows among the mix, and more than a few pirates of the Caribbean who went along for the ride. To be sure, that is always the case in war. But the fact is that for the most part, the Crusades were an attempt to pursue the agenda that was laid out at the very beginning by the leaders, including the great cry of Urban at Clermont. And that was to go and liberate the captive peoples, to demonstrate Christian mercy, to do their Christian duties, to save their brothers and sisters from a horrific defilement. Few events in history have been more colored by romantic imagination than the Crusades. You would hardly know it by walking into a bookstore these days, but you know, in the 18th and 19th centuries, boys' adventure literature almost always focused on one of two themes: the Crusades or global exploration aboard ship. The kinds of stories that ultimately gave rise to the genre that G.A. Henty was so prolific in was a genre that celebrated the Richard the Lionhearts, the Geoffreys of Bouillon, the stories of Godfrey and Beamond, of Bernard and St. Louis, of Baldwin and Frederick, of Innocent and Doge Enrico. Because their stories were remarkable stories of sacrifice and Christian virtue. I love the story of Richard the Lionheart on his way to go on crusade. After having given Scotland their freedom, for a price, of course, but a price that would be well used in the crusade, and God bless him evermore for that fact. After he gave Scotland their freedom, he made his way to Sicily. He wrote in his journal in this wonderful epic poem, I must go and liberate the women of Sicily, for there a morbid and disgusting law, altogether contrary from the virtues of Scripture, has bound them in a kind of slavery. In other words, he went to Sicily in order to free women from a horrific set of laws that supposedly Christian men had imposed for the purposes of subjugating women. I tell you that story simply because it gives you a glimpse of the fact that Richard was driven by this passion for justice. Along the way, he picked up his sister, who was in the midst of a very oppressive arranged marriage, and he stayed for 3 months to whip his brother-in-law into shape, in one case, literally whipping him into shape. He wrote love poetry. He made sure that his troops were well versed in the Scriptures, and though many of them could not themselves read, he made sure that there were readers so that the daily hours of the Scriptures could be read to them. He was a man who was the very picture of Christian chivalry. And he was very much like all those who went on crusade. The first wave of crusaders departed Europe in 1096. They undertook the conquest of coastal regions. They established 5 crusader kingdoms all along the way from the southern parts of Galatia, southward all the way to Jerusalem. They recovered Jerusalem and Bethlehem itself in 1099 and left behind a host of crusaders who would then begin to rebuild the once resplendent lands. The story of the rebuilding of those crusader kingdoms is a remarkable story in and of itself. If you ever travel to the Middle East, some of the most spectacular sights you'll ever see are the crusader castles and the crusader churches and the crusader gardens and the crusader hospitals. You see, they did not go to plunder the land, they went to restore it, to allow it to flower once again. The Second Crusade was undertaken in order to recover Edessa, one of the 5 kingdoms that had fallen in the interim. It was a series of coordinated German and French battalions who left Europe in 1145 and accomplished their primary tasks in Syria and Edessa by the year 1148. The Third Crusade was undertaken in 1187. This is the one that Richard the Lionheart fought in, along with Philip II of France and Frederick, the great Barbarossa of the Germanies. And this crusade, Cyprus was retaken after a long siege. Acre and Joppa were retaken, although Jerusalem was ultimately lost to the brilliance of Salah ad-Din. The Fourth Crusade turned out to be an internal war. This is where the Crusades begin to take a turn for the worse. This is the beginning of the end of the great flowering of Christendom in what we today call the medieval period. It would not be until the 14th century that we would see a precipitous decline of all of the virtues that had given rise to Christendom. But by 1198, when the Fourth Crusade had begun, all the way through to its conclusion in 1204, with the Venetians taking the lead, we are already seeing the undoing of the Christian West. All of the reasons why later Martin Luther and John Calvin and Theodore Beza and Ulrich Zwingli and John Knox would have to do their work were already at play. There was a Fifth Crusade in 1217, a Sixth Crusade in 1228, a Seventh Crusade in 1248, an Eighth Crusade in 1267. There was, of course, in the 13th century, a Children's Crusade. By this time, stories of valor, of liberty and justice had permeated all the way to the youngest of the young, inspired by the notion of running off and joining another kind of circus, I suppose. Thousands upon thousands of youngsters embarked on a journey. It turned out badly, as you might expect. And yet, what is remarkable is that at the time, virtually no chroniclers or historians denigrated the attempt, because it was an outworking, as one chronicler said, of the ideas of covenantal succession, however misguided. Here's the bottom line. The Crusades were intended to recover the Christian largesse of the Middle East. Whatever their reasons, the knights and nobles who would eventually hear and heed the initial call to take the cross as a holy vow to redeem the East were the best that Christendom had to offer. They included Robert of Normandy and Raymond of Toulouse and Beamon of Toronto and Robert of Flanders and Godfrey of Bouillon and Baldwin of Bouillon and Stephen of Blois. The first crusading army was gathered in the winter of 1095 and the spring of 1096 and included about 50,000 men-at-arms. By the end of the crusading movement, some 2.5 million young men, and in some cases young women, had embarked on a journey to somehow recover the lands of the East. A couple of additional facts that we probably ought to have in mind as we draw some conclusions about the character and nature of the Crusades. First fact, throughout its long history, Islam has never converted a single nation. Every single land that is today an Islamic land was conquered by the sword. No nations have ever willingly converted to Islam. Secondly, no nation that has been subjugated by Islam has ever been subjugated quietly, peacefully, or gently. Some of the most horrific bloodletting that the world has ever known has come as Islam has performed its death march on the world. Third, Islam has never produced a society of widespread freedom or prosperity. Now that may come as a shock to you because you probably have read of some of the caliphates from Baghdad that achieved great accomplishments in mathematics and astronomy. But the fact is that those great accomplishments in architecture, engineering, mathematics, geometry, engineering, and so forth, those were actually brought into existence by conquered Byzantine scholars and experts and craftsmen. Virtually all of the achievements of Islam through the years have come by conquest of Greek or Roman or Christian achievements, academics, engineering, craftsmanship. Now I tell you all of that because it's important to put into perspective what it was that the Crusaders were attempting to do. Now here's the question. Were they right? Should they have done it? And many of the Crusaders themselves wrestled with this question. Should we go out? They wrestled with all of the details of Augustine's just war theory. They weighed the possibilities of great loss against the compelling reasons for mercy and justice. Now, I would submit to you that if we were living in 1095, we would probably feel about the Crusades something like what we feel about, say, the war in Iraq or Afghanistan. And that is, we would be torn. We would be ambivalent. We would be saying to ourselves, you know, as a sovereign nation, we have no business sending our troops over there. At the same time, how long does terror reign? And so we would, in this room, probably be divided. There are many conservative Christians who are quite adamant that we don't belong there in Iraq or Afghanistan. This is madness. We've put our sons and daughters in grave jeopardy. It's a war that we cannot win. And those arguments are quite compelling, aren't they? And at the same time, we have the very real specter that the so-called global war on terror is philosophically endemic to the character and nature of Islam. And the war will be brought to us. It already has been, but it will be again. Again and again and again. So how do we respond? Bottom line is, these are complex questions, aren't they? It's not easy to caricature the Crusades and then simply dismiss them out of hand. The story of the Crusades are incredibly relevant to our own time. The arguments waged on all sides are arguments that sound eerily familiar, because the issues are the same. You see, Muhammad believed that ultimately the works righteousness, the ideological system of Islam, depended upon global conquest. Faithfulness was measured not simply by the adherence to the 5 pillars, it was measured by the pursuit of this radical agenda. As a result, throughout history, we have seen signs of janissaries, those conscripted terror corps, in one form or another, coming to the West, taking back the advantages, and then turning them against us for the task of fulfilling the Islamic dream of a single world, united, declaring the Shahada. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. The Crusaders wrestled with these things, these ideas, these complexities, and they determined to take action. John Calvin, once commenting about the threat of Islam, which was quite current in his time during the Reformation. In fact, many historians would argue that the Reformation was actually able to succeed precisely because Charles, the Habsburg emperor, was distracted by the assaults of Suleiman the Magnificent on the eastern side of his empire, and therefore could not turn his full attention to the Lutherans and the Calvinists. And so in a peculiar providence, it was Suleiman the Magnificent's march on Vienna, in which he came perilously close to taking out the last Christian army standing between Mecca and London. We can see that God somehow used that to incubate the Reformation. But John Calvin said this: until the church finds the heart and the will to care for those lost souls bound in Islam with the hope of the gospel, we shall always be at peril. We shall always be at peril. Calvin's solution was not the launching of a crusade. Now, although he certainly understood the need at times to rally the arms, his vision was, let's find a way to win those lands. And let's have the heart cry of John Knox, oh God, give me a rock or I die. Or crusade after crusade after crusade will ultimately be our lot. lest we be subsumed. A couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to visit the great land of Iraq. Just shortly after Saddam had been deposed by our troops, and Iraqi TV stopped broadcasting those remarkable news flashes that the Americans were hiding in their trenches. I flew into to Baghdad and met with a number of the troops, and then made my way into the north where the Kurds are, and then had the opportunity to go and attend and speak at a remarkable pastors' conference in the city of Kirkuk. It's a city that I probably couldn't or shouldn't visit today because of new violence between Turks and Sunnis and Kurds and Shiites. But there in the city of Kirkuk, this historic pastors' conference was called together. There were pastors from Iraq, the indigenous churches, those whose faith through the years had not been snuffed out by Islamic oppression. These sons and daughters of the covenant from so far back. And some of them were Eastern churches, some of them were Byzantine Rite, some of them were Roman Catholic in their orientation, some were Protestants. The conference was actually held in a little Presbyterian church in the city of Kirkuk, a little walled compound. The pastor who brought me in was proudly showing me about the place, and I was just astonished. It's a Presbyterian church in the middle of the Middle East in Kirkuk, Iraq. I asked him about the history of the thing, and he said, oh, yes, I don't know all of the history, but in the 1840s, the students of a great Scottish theologian, I believe his name was Chalmers or something, sent out his students around the world believing that the gospel could set the nations free. One of those students made his way here and established this little church. And won a whole neighborhood to Christ, and their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren and their great-great-grandchildren and their great-great-great-grandchildren worship here to this day. And we have been praying that one day Christians around the world would once again get a vision for what it would be like to win the world for Jesus. In that conference, there were pastors from churches that had not spoken to one another in more than 1,000 years because of one theological squabble or another. There were two pastors there from the city of Baghdad whose churches were 5 blocks apart. They had anathematized each other and excommunicated each other a millennium earlier. And there they were in this little Presbyterian church in Kirkuk. I saw them embrace. It was the first meeting of all of the churches in that region since 324, when a synod was held to determine what delegates would go to the Council of Nicaea. Because you see, a great interruption has occurred. The conquest of those lands by an alien faith. But because that alien faith has left those people in thrall for centuries, left them with the lowest literacy rate in the world, the highest infant mortality rate in the world, they're ready for something else. It will either be crusade or gospel. Now, I'm involved in a missions organization called Servant Group International. In fact, Kay Doxtall is here. She's from a servant group. Kay, wave so people can see you. We're starting classical Christian schools and helping to plant churches and disciple young men and women right in the heart of Iraq. Because I tell you what, I don't want my sons and daughters to have to fight in another crusade. But I do know that I do not have the liberty or the convenience of doing nothing. And brothers and sisters, neither do you. The gospel is true. The gospel is the only hope for freedom and liberty throughout all of the world. That was the notion that the Crusaders were wrestling with but never quite got a hold of, particularly after the Fourth Crusade. But we can learn from them. We can learn from their chivalry, and we can learn from their sense of justice, and we can learn from their passion, and we can learn from their strategies, and we can learn from their mobilization to bring a better hope and a better answer at this moment, this providential moment in time, when we have the opportunity to change the world. Because the gospel is true.